I've invited Josiah Nissley. Some of you might know him, formerly Karis Sigler, married Josiah, and they've been married for a few years now. But Josiah has an interesting testimony of one who went through a season of doubts and struggles, and I've invited him to come. I'm going to grab a microphone. Actually, I'm wearing a microphone. I don't need to grab one. I'll let you use this one.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask Josiah if you could just tell us a little bit about your upbringing, your childhood, your introduction to Christianity first.
Yeah. Well, I wrote everything out just because I didn't really trust myself, because I have a tendency to go on rabbit trails. So I'll be reading most of what I say. But I grew up in a Christian home. I was saved around 4 or 5 years old, and subsequently baptized maybe around 11 or 12. And I want to be clear here that although I was young, I do think I understood the basics and was sincere in my faith. I soon got involved in Bible quizzing through my church's Awana. As I got a little older, I was actively involved in my youth group, including leadership roles. Hang on, trying to find my spot. And I remember, and I was a member of our church's praise band. I also volunteered in various capacities and went on mission trips. I even started Bible study one summer after returning from a youth conference. It took me a couple years, but I think I first finished reading through the Bible cover to cover around the age of 14 or so. I say these things not because any of them made me a better Christian or saved me, but they do provide evidence for the sincerity of my faith.
So what is it that came up in your mind? What were the impetuses that caused you to begin to struggle with doubts about the truthfulness of Christianity?
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time yesterday trying to figure out how to tell the story and what was important to share and what I could leave out. So again, I wrote it all out. So from the age of 4, when I got saved around there, to 24, I have had a desire for 2 things: to know what's true and to do what's right. That doesn't mean I always believe what's true. That doesn't mean I always do what's right. But in my soul, in the deepest part of my nature, that is what I desire. These are 2 very defining characteristics of my personality, and I think they're what brought me to faith in Christianity as a young boy, and they're also part of what brought me to question it as I grew up. These questions really began to surface in middle school. I was quickly introduced to well-known apologists, including the likes of Sean McDowell and Ken Ham and others, and for several years I felt more intellectually confident in my faith than I think I ever have. I remember a distinct conversation with my best friend at the time where I was juiced up on apologetics, and I told him I just want to debate an atheist right now. But it's funny because in less than 2 or 3 years, I became the skeptic that I wanted to debate. To explain how I got to that point is tough. I think one of the first things that triggered it was that as I continued to gather what I'll call apologetic ammunition, I realized that many of the arguments for God and Christianity were mutually exclusive. One argument might support the evidence of God by pointing to the Big Bang as evidence for the beginning of the universe and its need for a creator, while another might dismiss this entirely, suggesting an old universe is inconsistent with the proper interpretation of Scripture and that the scientific evidence supports a young universe. Why was I getting an internally inconsistent defense of Christianity? And that last word, defense, was key in the formation of my questions and doubts. I realized I really wasn't pursuing truth as much as I was trying to affirm what I already thought was true. I didn't feel like that was right. I wanted to pursue the truth with an open mind. I started to listen to people of all worldviews and perspectives, including skeptics and atheists, not just the caricatures of them I was fed by the apologist. And it turned out most of them were not the overly arrogant God haters that I envisioned, the Richard Dawkins of the world. They were normal people. Many of them were genuinely good people. Some even acted like Jesus, more than many of the Christians I knew. They just had sincere doubts and often legitimate criticisms of my faith. They brought forth credible issues and difficult to answer questions that the apologetic answers I would have previously given no longer seemed to hold up against. My doubts fell roughly into 2 categories. The first would be intellectual. This includes seeming contradictions between science and the Bible, contradictions within the Bible itself, especially as it relates to the Old and New Testament. And second would be moral. How could a good God allow such meaningless suffering? How could I worship a God who seems to command genocide in the Old Testament or permit slavery? This by no means is an exhaustive list, but those were some of the things that prompted me to have serious questions with Christianity, even to the point where I didn't identify as a Christian anymore for a time. I was probably best described as an agnostic atheist, meaning I wasn't sure what I believed about God, but I was still open to the possibility. And that's an important thing to note. In all of this, I genuinely was still seeking truth, even if I no longer believed it was found in Christianity at the time. To be honest, this was a period of my life that was very difficult. It was not easy when the communion plate was passed by, and I chose to abstain in front of my friends and my family because I didn't believe it was my place to take part in something that I wasn't still believing in. It wasn't easy when I had to tell my music leader of the past 6 years that I did not feel right continuing to play in the worship team because of where I was at. It wasn't easy seeing the heartache and quite literally the weeping of those who love me try everything in their power to pull me back into Christian belief. It would have been way easier for me to lie to myself and to others and just continue to go through the motions, continue to label myself a Christian when I knew that I was not. I think this is hard for a lot of Christians to swallow because it feels like if anyone isn't convinced, there has to be something else going on. It can't just be that that person is genuinely seeking truth and trying to do what's right. So what happens is people will rationalize rather than listen to the doubter. They might suggest things like, oh, you must have not had a sincere conversion to begin with, or this must mean you don't care about morality anymore, or you clearly aren't honestly engaging with the evidence. And for me, that could not be further from the truth. And to Pastor Mike's sermon today, people can and do walk away from Christianity for any number of reasons. So I'm not suggesting everyone's story looks like my own. But if you know someone seeking, remember that God is the one who knows their heart, not you.
So Josiah, what were the catalysts that brought you back to a place of confidence in the Christian narrative and the scriptures?
Hang on, let me get a drink of water here. I think it wouldn't be that hard to read, but it's harder than it looks. So I suppose the best place to start is by sharing a story. One afternoon, as I was exploring my university's campus, I went to Indiana University, go Hoosiers. We're going to be really good this year, by the way. I discovered a room that was typically closed off to students. And as I walked in, the sun was radiating through the windows, and the whole of Bloomington was as green and beautiful as it ever gets. In the room sat one other person. And as I strolled around, taking in the view, the person said, "Beautiful, isn't it?" And no, his name wasn't Jesus. His name was Ethan. But as we got to talking, it turned out he was a Christian. He was also a PhD student studying philosophy of religion and science. I was surprised because statistically, very few people in the philosophy department at a state university are. But he was, and this fascinated me. We hit it off immediately. Since he was new to the university and finding a community, oddly enough, I invited him to church with me. And yes, I was still attending church because I still cared about the community and many of the values it upheld. Something felt different about Ethan. It wasn't just that Ethan was smarter than me, and trust me, he was. This guy's got like 140 IQ. It was that when he became aware that I was an agnostic, or whatever you want to label me during that period, he treated me no different. When we had conversations about my doubts or I asked questions, he did not come across trying to win an argument or offer me an easy fix to my doubts, like I would have loved to do back in middle school when I wanted to debate that atheist. When I asked questions he couldn't answer, he told me something I rarely ever heard from the apologist. I don't know. Ethan treated me like a person and not a project. I never felt like in the back of Ethan's mind he was trying to figure out how to work on me, how to get me to think this or believe that. I only ever felt like I was talking to a friend who listened. When I told Ethan where I was coming from and why I had doubts, that it was genuinely an intellectual and moral concern, he believed me, that I genuinely wanted to know the truth and do what was right. Instead of rationalizing my situation, he listened. People think that the mark of a good philosopher is one who spends their time rationalizing, and while of course that is much of what philosophers do, the mark of a good philosopher is one who listens, one who observes. Also, this is why Ethan's going to be a really good philosopher. He's almost got his thesis finished. It's one who tries to see reality for what it is instead of fit it into some box of their own creation. And because he listened, as our relationship evolved, I started to realize that many of the questions and doubts I held were not on their own central to the Christian faith. Of course, some were, but I realized to commit my life to God does not require you to have all your ducks in a row, either intellectually or with respect to life in general. That is not to say that continual evidence and reason did not help me build back the pillars of my faith, but the way I started to think about truth and my desire to know it changed. Maybe truth wasn't just an intellectual question. Maybe God wasn't just an intellectual question, but instead a living reality. In my studies on the brain and understanding how the physical world works at university, I got my undergrad for neuroscience there, I realized that when you go deep enough, you run into an ultimate mystery, one that reveals something greater than you can imagine. At the center of all this life around us, is not just fact. It is a seemingly hidden yet ever-present reality that points to God. You know, one of my favorite books of the Bible is Job. Job was a man who had everything, status and wealth, family, and yet God allowed everything to be taken away. Job experienced excruciating loss and suffering. And what did those around him do? Well, his friends told him the cause of his suffering must have been sin, despite this not being a clear reason for God permitting Job to suffer in the text. His wife told him he should just curse God and die. And frankly, Job had every reason to do so. Yet he held on. And what happens when God eventually reveals himself to Job? Does God give Job an explanation for all his questions and his suffering? He doesn't. What does God do? He reminds him who God is and who Job is. And that's what God did for me. Did I get answers to all my doubts and questions? No. But God gave me what I needed. He showed me that I was missing the point. Like so many of the Pharisees who tried to put God in a box, I thought I needed to do the same in order to believe. The heart of Christianity is not intellectual perfection. The heart of Christianity is the gospel. For those who are doubting and questioning God, for those who might not even think that a God exists, but believe there's something more, keep seeking. Keep learning. If you are seeking, that likely means you recognize there is something to this world, that despite all the suffering and the darkness, there is beauty, wonder, and meaning in this life. I can't promise that you'll be convinced of Christianity before you pass away. I can't. I wish I could, but I can't. But I do believe that when Jesus says, "Seek and you shall find," that he means it. I do believe that God is a loving God and that he desires for all his creation to be reconciled to himself. That the whole of creation is reverberating the glory of God. And yet, it is broken, and many of us are lost. I think our sin is best understood not as a violation of some set of specific dogmas or rules. That is what Jesus continually pushed against with the Pharisees. Rather, sin quite literally translates in both the Greek and the Hebrew to missing the mark. Sin is us acting in a way that skews the image we were created to reflect, the image of God. Yes, the world is not how it was intended to be. There is suffering and death, but I believe that God has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ, and that through him, death has been conquered. That Jesus has provided a way for us to enter back into the kingdom of God. Not just in some future reality, but right now. Jesus is the image of God, the image of what it looks like to not miss the mark that every one of us are missing. And the gospel is an active invitation for us to take back the image we were created to reflect. The gospel is an invitation to reconcile us back to our Creator God. There is no greater truth than that.
Thanks, Josiah.